Hello, it's Tammy Marshall again. Today I'm going to share with you a short story I wrote that's basically intended more for a young audience, children, young adults. It's about an elementary teacher and named Mr. Collins. And I kind of have ideas of writing more stories about Mr. Collins, but this is just one that kind of came to me one night and I wrote it. And it was one of the stories that was selected to be included into the anthology put out by the Nebraska Writers Guild. This anthology came out a couple months ago called Stories from the Heartland. It's the 5th volume. So I have a couple stories in here, a couple poems. I did share my Alma Vita poem. It's in a different video if you'd care to view that. Anyway, this particular story, as I said, is about Mr. Collins, and it is called Mr. Collins and the Lost Sense of Humor. Mr. Collins had lost his sense of humor. He had it on Monday when he gave his students an actual pop quiz and asked them to name the sodas for each brand label. He had it on Tuesday evening when he jumped out at Mrs. Collins from the darkened laundry room as she passed and yelled, "Underwear? Under there!" before pelting her with fresh from the dryer wadded up underwear. Little had he known, though, that Mrs. Collins knew what he was up to, and she was prepared for his shenanigans with a basket of rolled-up socks that served as the perfect-sized grenades in a counterattack to his underwear assault. He still had it yesterday, Wednesday morning, when his boss, Principal Fitzsimmons, stopped him in the hallway to give him his class's quarterly progress reports. She smiled and slapped him on the back. "Keep up the good work, Mr. Collins," she said. Mr. Collins whistled all the way back to his 5th grade classroom, where he greeted his students with an extra enthusiastic, "Hello, boys and girls." Then he shared the good news with them, and they celebrated with 10 minutes more of recess that afternoon. But today, Thursday, Mr. Collins awoke feeling blue and listless. He lay in bed for a while, trying to figure out what was missing. He knew he'd lost something, but he couldn't put his finger on it. He couldn't ask Mrs. Collins because she'd already left for her job at the hospital. He arose and looked at the cat. But the cat simply stretched and then meowed for his breakfast. Mr. Collins continued to be puzzled while he fed the cat, sipped his morning coffee, showered, dressed for work, and even as he drove to the school. Still confused, he entered the building and ran into the janitor, Mr. Quigley. Mr. Quigley was a grumpy man, but he always stopped to hear one of Mr. Collins' jokes. So he paused in anticipation. But Mr. Collins just walked right past Mr. Quigley. The older man scratched his head, shrugged his shoulders, and returned to sweeping the floor, grumbling loudly about the dirt Mr. Collins was tracking in. But Mr. Collins didn't hear him. Mr. Collins stood looking glumly out the window as his students began to file into the classroom. "Hello, Mr. Collins!" Many of them enthusiastically cheered in greeting, as they were accustomed to doing each day. But on this day, Mr. Collins didn't turn around with his usual goofy grin to greet them in return. Instead, he remained with his back to the students as they slowly took their seats, looking with confusion at each other. The ringing of the first bell finally caught Mr. Collins' attention, and he turned around to face his students. "Hello, boys and girls," he said in a dull monotone. Billy, an outspoken boy, suddenly blurted, "Oh, I get what you're doing, Mr. Collins. You're pretending, aren't you?" He smiled up at the teacher from his seat in the second row. Mr. Collins simply gazed back at him with a blank expression on his face. Then he turned to the board and began to write out the day's math problems. The students all looked at each other, shrugged, and then began to copy the problems into their notebooks. Normally, Mr. Collins would add an occasional smiley face to the zeros in the math problems, or he'd add a top hat and cane to the 8s, or he'd make all the numbers either extra fat or super towering, anything to catch the students' eyes and to keep them interested in math. Today, though, Mr. Collins wrote his numbers in perfectly straight lines. Perfectly boring straight lines. Gabriella, a spunky girl who regularly told her parents, "Mr. Collins is the best teacher ever," finally blurted, "What's wrong, Mr. Collins?" Mr. Collins blinked at her from behind his glasses. Then he did something no student had ever seen him do. Mr. Collins frowned. The entire class gasped, and one shy girl named Haley suddenly burst into tears. Mr. Collins surveyed his classroom of confused 5th graders. I feel like I've lost something, but I don't know what. Billy's hand shot up even as he yelled out, "Ooh, ooh, ooh, is it your keys?" Mr. Collins shook his head as he patted his left front trousers pocket. Everyone could hear the jingle of Mr. Collins' keys. Billy started to lower his hand, and then it shot back up as he shouted, "Ooh, ooh, ooh, I know, your wallet. My dad always loses his wallet." Some of the students nodded at Billy's suggestion, but they quickly stopped as Mr. Collins drew forth his well-worn leather wallet from his right back trousers pocket. He waved it above his head for all to see before replacing it in his pocket. "Now, get to work on these math problems and remember to show your work," he said as he scowled at the students. Their momentarily joyful expressions all fell as they quickly got to work on their math equations. Mr. Collins wandered among their desks and pointed out errors as he saw them, but at no point did he offer up a "good job" or a pat on the back, as he usually did. The students stole worried, sidelong glances at each other. Mr. Collins' odd demeanor continued through their mid-morning spelling lesson and their grammar quiz. Then, thankfully, it was time for recess. The students rushed to line up at the door where they waited as patiently as possible for Mr. Collins to exchange his dress shoes for his tennis shoes, because he normally took part in a friendly kickball or basketball game with them. But today, Mr. Collins simply marched them down the hall to the side door of the school. Instead of rushing outside to play, the students slowly trudged out and stood around for a bit, unsure of what to do and how to behave without Mr. Collins' guidance. Mr. Collins stood near the school looking up at the sky. He seemed lost. Haley hesitantly approached him and tugged on his shirt sleeve. Mr. Collins slowly looked down at the small, shy girl. "I know what you lost, Mr. Collins," she timidly said. "You do?" His bushy eyebrows shot up in surprise. She nodded seriously up at him. Mr. Collins leaned down to peer into her face. "What, Haley? What did I lose?" She gave him a small smile and answered, "Your sense of humor, Mr. Collins." Mr. Collins stood up straight and stroked his chin. "You might be right, Haley. But if that's what I lost, how can I possibly find it?" He looked back down at Haley, but she just shrugged. Suddenly, a flock of small birds flew overhead. Mr. Collins turned his face upward to watch them pass over, and splat, splush, a glob of bird poop landed square on Mr. Collins' forehead and began to slide down his prominent nose. He quickly pulled out the handkerchief he always kept in his right front trousers pocket and wiped at his forehead. As he pulled the dirty cloth away from his face, he saw that every 4th, 5th, and 6th grade student had stopped what they were doing, some in mid-stride even, and they were all staring at him with wide eyes. A smile began to tug at the corner of Mr. Collins' mouth. Then it spread across his lips into a grin, and finally those lips parted to show all his teeth before he opened his mouth wide and started to laugh loudly. Soon every student on the playground joined in with their own laughter. The end of recess bell rang, and as the students filed back into the building, Mr. Collins yelled out for all to hear, "I sure am feeling pooped! How about the rest of you?" Students laughed and rushed off to tell everyone who missed it what had happened to Mr. Collins during recess. As they entered his classroom, Mr. Collins smiled at his students, who in turn smiled back at him and gave each other relieved glances. He winked at Haley as he told the class, "Just as one little bird was telling me what I'd lost, another little bird flew over and gave it back to me." He paused before saying, "And in a very disgusting way, I might add." The students laughed, and a couple looked like they might get sick when Billy pointed out that Mr. Collins still had a small chunk of bird poop lodged in one of his bushy eyebrows. Mr. Collins wiped it away with a clean corner of his soiled handkerchief. "Kids, let this be a lesson to you all. Never lose your sense of humor. If you do, you'll end up with poop on your face." He grinned at them, and they smiled back. "Now, who's ready for lunch?" he yelled out to them with a devilish gleam in his eye. The 5th graders groaned in disgust at the thought of eating after what they'd just witnessed. "Hey, Mr. Collins," Billy shouted across the room. "My grandpa told me that in the Philippines they eat bird nest soup. Maybe we could get even with that bird who pooped on you." The entire class roared with laughter as they swarmed toward the door to line up for lunch. Mr. Collins smiled down on them all. Thanks for joining me.